First, we have Matt Hongoltz-Hepling. Matt is a former reporter for the Valley News. He's a journalist and an author. He's a Pulitzer finalist and has received the George Polk Award for investigative reporting. His recent book, which I'm sure a lot of you have read, A Libertarian Walks into a Bear, discusses some radical fringe political beliefs, including people who favor anarchy, the legalization of cannibalism, and secession from the United States. And we also have Heather Tsavaris, who has worked across sectors, including the federal government and private sector and philanthropic sector, to develop and implement innovative and award-winning solutions to some of the world's most difficult challenges. Her time in the government included more than a decade at the U.S. Department of State and U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where she focused on solutions that countered terrorist recruitment. So we're look forward to hearing from both of these, and we're going to have Matt lead us off.
All right, thank you so much, Donna, and to the folks for having me here. My name is Matt. I'm wearing pajama pants right now, just because I can. And I'm here mostly because of the experiences I had while researching my book, A Libertarian Walks into a Bear. And I'm gonna start up a screen sharing function here so that I can show you a little bit while I talk. And here we go. If you like to read, please buy a copy of my book. If you don't like to read, please know that they make excellent fly swatters, but they wear out, so you might have to buy 2 or 3. So while I was working for our beloved local newspaper, the Valley News, I was sent to the Upper Valley town of Grafton, New Hampshire. It is a modest town. You can see it here. This is the town garage here, right next to it with the red roof. That is the fire station. This house-looking thing is the municipal town offices. And that tiny little adjunct that looks like it was an addition to the original house is the police station. And that's where the town's only full-time police officer, their police chief, works out of. So that is basically the heart of Grafton. It's not an extravagant place. You probably know places like this. So I went there to interview a Vietnam War era veteran. Her name was Jessica Soul. And she was there, she called the newspaper rather, because she wanted the VA to make her home more handicap accessible. So this is what she looked like when I visited her. And while I was there, we were just kind of like chit-chatting about her cats, because it's a good icebreaker and I like animals. And she said, oh, I used to let my cats outside, but that was before the bears came. And I thought, oh my goodness, I sort of perked up. Bears were so much more interesting to me than the VA. And Jessica told me about a series of harrowing bear encounters that she'd endured. And after talking with her, I was so intrigued that I started to ask others in the area about their bear encounters. And it soon became clear to me that there were more and weirder bear encounters in Grafton than in anywhere else that I had ever been. So while I was trying to figure out why that was, I began to learn about something else that makes Grafton unique, the Freetown Project. This was a utopian social experiment in which a group of libertarians from all around the country decided that they wanted to come and shape Grafton into a place that would reflect libertarian values. And I came to understand, as I asked more and more questions, that bear management was a perfect way to explore how different political philosophies can affect the fortunes of a community. But before I explain how libertarianism relates to bear management, let me just tell you a little bit about the libertarians that I encountered as I roamed Grafton, knocking on doors and talking to folks about bears and life. So this might come as a shock to you because I know who I'm talking to. But what I found is that most libertarians were like you. And when I say you, I'm presuming that you are mostly progressive Democrats. These libertarians that I spoke to were, for the most part, perfectly friendly, kind people. They got involved in politics because they genuinely wanted to make America a better place for themselves. And like you, they're watching the Tiger King and the Avengers movies and engaging in all these wholesome activities like hiking and mushroom hunting and learning to play guitar and all of this stuff. That is true. Many of them are strict pacifists. They support gay marriage and the decriminalization of marijuana, and they reject the most overt forms of racist and otherwise bigoted ideology. And when you have an opportunity to talk politics with a libertarian or other person that you might think of as an insurrectionist, I hope that you'll take the time to find those things you have in common, establish some sort of a relationship, and then be unafraid to argue politics. Because this ability to argue freely, I feel pretty strongly that this is a fundamental basis of our democracy. That being said, there are some key differences between you and these libertarians who live in your backyard. So progressives, we tend to fantasize about a world where everyone has equal access to life's many pleasures, where nobody is suffering, and where everybody kind of lives sustainably upon the earth in a way that we can pass down for generations. The libertarian fantasy is much different. It's more kind of like pioneer days. In their ideal world, people are kind of defending their property with guns. There's no compulsory taxation and no government regulation on things like education and healthcare and the environment. It's a very masculine sort of fantasy, this idea that you're like defending your homestead, right? And only the strong shall survive. And so it may not surprise you to learn that the Libertarian Party is mostly made up of men. So they wanted to build a utopia. There's not really many places in the world that embrace as a community the sorts of values that libertarians are espousing. The closest thing on earth to a libertarian place is Hong Kong. You can see here, they have a lot of money in Hong Kong, but as this picture implies, there is an enormous disparity between the haves and the have-nots. You can see the skyscrapers, you can see the shanty town, and Hong Kong is one of the, has some of the worst income inequality in the entire world, according to a ranking by the CIA of all people. So in Grafton, under the Freetown Project, when the libertarians came, a lot of these guys established armed camps in the woods. They lived in non-traditional structures like campers and yurts, shipping containers and off-grid cabins, and even tents. And they changed the culture of the town while they were there. And they also undermined public services. They fought against taxes being raised, and they also refused to comply with rules, which put an added strain on municipal resources. So the Freetown Project ran from 2004 until about 2016. And during that time period, by almost any measure, Grafton became a worse place to live. The police chief, who was also the town's only full-time police officer, had to get up at town meeting and tell everyone that he'd had to take his cruiser off the road because he couldn't afford repairs to make it safe. They also turned off streetlights to save on electricity. Another impact that I like to talk about and that I describe in detail in my book is involves the town's most precious historic resource, which was this church. The town refused to take ownership of it because they worried that it might be a tax burden. And so a Freetowner named John Cannell bought it for $68,000. And then he moved into it and said, hey, I'm going to live here. He then died in a fire that basically destroyed the church. And so this was an enormous loss for the town. And there were other impacts in Grafton from the heavy concentration of these libertarians. Neighbor complaints went up, recycling rates went down, registered sex offenders tripled in town in their numbers. The town's legal expenses went up because it kept getting sued. Crime became more extreme. There was a meth lab discovered by, I think it was county law enforcement officers. And there had never been a murder in Grafton in living memory, but an argument got out of hand. A resident called her roommate a freeloader, and he murdered her. And then that was followed immediately by the second murder in living memory when the same man murdered his other roommate. And meanwhile, the bears, right? All those men living in all those unusual structures managed their food and their food waste in their own ways. And so this meant that some were feeding the bears unintentionally. There were also, as I talk about in the book, many residents who were feeding the bears on purpose, just for the joy of watching them eat. And in most communities, when there's a problem bear, somebody calls the state. The state sends someone out who will investigate and then determine whether the bear ought to be relocated or euthanized, or whether maybe the solution is just to tell somebody to take in their bird feeder. But in Grafton, this process wasn't happening. There wasn't any troubleshooting because remember, the Libertarians were so anti-authoritarian that they would never look to their state for solutions. They wanted to handle the bears on their own. And so they shouted at bears and put cayenne pepper on their garbage to give the bears a snootful of pain. They set booby traps and threw firecrackers at their heads. And all of this had the net result of causing the bears to associate humans with food. So before the Freetown Project, there hadn't been a single bear attack in the state of New Hampshire for as much as 150 years. But during the Freetown Project, there was an attack in Grafton, the first attack in like 150 years in the whole state, and it was on a woman named Tracy Colbert, who was ironically a member of a vulnerable population. She was living in a trailer home. She was not a Freetowner. She was not a gun owner. And yet her doorstep happened to be the one that the bear showed up on. And you can read about the attack in detail in my recently published Fly Swatter, A Libertarian Walks into a Bear. So since Tracy was attacked, there have been 2 more attacks in neighboring towns. And unless people get better about following the science and experts on this issue, I'm sure that there will be more attacks, and eventually that will lead to a fatality. And so that's kind of like the basis of my book. That is how the libertarian philosophy intersects with bears and bear management. But I'd like to leave you with just like a little bit of kind of like my take on how you should deal with these insurrectionists in our backyards. So there are some libertarians in your backyard, despite what I've said, who are everything that you fear. They have ties to white supremacists and the insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. They have disturbing numbers of firearms, and they advocate getting rid of the US government, either through a coup or through a peaceful secession from America. And there are examples of disagreements with the extremists that have turned violent, even here in the Upper Valley. But don't assume that all libertarians or even all anarchists are violent. Libertarianism is an idea, and in many ways, it's a bad idea. But I'm glad to have that voice in the public discourse because it is a check against becoming too much of an authoritarian state. And I would urge you to instead think of a libertarian in your community like you might think of a child who you worry might start hanging out with the bad kids, right? Like I have a lot of people that I know who say like, well, you know, I have some libertarian leanings. And what that means is that there are some things in the libertarian philosophy, some of which I've referenced, like gay rights, that a progressive can wholeheartedly agree with. And so if you ostracize a mushy libertarian and berate them for their ideals at every turn, you're just driving them right into the arms of the wrong element. And so with a little love and support and understanding, like that wayward child, they might just realize at some point that they were going through a phase, and maybe they will grow up and be a good kid. I could have gone into plenty more detail, but I thought that this might just be kind of like a good overview to get the discussion started. And so now I am going to yield the floor, as they say, to the presenters so that we can hear what Heather has to say.
Thank you, Matt. And can you hear me?
I can hear you. I have to suss out how to stop sharing.
Maybe. Okay. There we go.
Wait, did I do it? Did I do it?
Yes. I think
all right, carry on.
Good. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing here. All right. There we go. So first of all, I'm just so grateful to be here with you all tonight. I'm going to check my time because sometimes I can get a little wordy. So I'm honored to kind of share some of my experiences and thoughts with you all. And I was asked to speak to you all about these thoughts kind of after I published a piece for CNN the month before last. And for that CNN piece, I shared how my decade working for the US government as a counterterrorism analyst really helped inform how I saw and understood what happened on January 6th at our Capitol. And this evening, what I'd like to do is I want to actually share with you a little bit more about those stories, what my decade's worth of experience kind of got me. And I want to introduce you to some folks who I feel like I know pretty well. I either know them because I've studied them for years, or I know them because I know people who were very close to them. A couple are more recently on my radar, but I think it's important, and I share their stories, and I want to share about them because they have very, very diverse backgrounds for the most part. But I think what is most striking is how similar they are to one another. And frankly, how similar they are to so many of us in the Zoom room tonight. And my hope is that through sharing these stories and sharing some of my experience in this way, we might all have a better understanding of those who cleave to these extremist beliefs. And we might all have a better way to personally, as individuals or as communities, to help stem that. So with that, I want to introduce you to Mohammed Bouyeri. And Mohammed Bouyeri is a man who I came to know around 2005 while walking the streets of West Amsterdam with a policeman who actually had known Mohammed for many, many years. And he knew Mohammed, and his name was Toon. And so he knew Mohammed because Mohammed was a Moroccan Dutch young man. And he was volunteering in a community organization, and he cared deeply about the Moroccan Dutch boys in his neighborhood, because he knew that those Moroccan Dutch boys were very likely to end up involved in petty crime, much more likely in some ways than to end up going to university, or much more likely to end up incarcerated than getting a middle-class job. And so Toon would often share stories about Mohammed. And the one that he shared that I'll never forget so many years later is when Mohammed got very, very excited about having a computer lab for those boys. And he tried to get funding, he tried to get people excited, and no one did. No one went for Mohammed's idea. And so kind of over the years, Mohammed slowly found another group to give a lot of his energy and attention to. And that group was Al-Qaeda. And the ideology that he adhered to was Salafi jihadism. And the world came to know Mohammed one November day in 2004, when he shot, stabbed, and attempted to decapitate Theo van Gogh. Mohammed is now serving a life sentence in the Netherlands. Another man that I have come to know over the years is this gentleman, Abdullahi Yusuf. And Abdullahi was born in the late 90s in a refugee camp in Kenya. And he and his family emigrated or were resettled here in the US, in the Minneapolis area. And Abdullahi talks about growing up, and he often talks about how he remembered, after 9/11, kids ribbing him for being a terrorist because he was Somali, he was Muslim. And he shares that he never really felt like he belonged. And he also shares that as he got older and he became a teenager, he realized that there wasn't really anyone in his family who had lived the American dream, right? That had achieved success. Because Abdullahi said there was only one person I knew in my family who had even attempted college. And over the years, Abdullahi eventually found some belonging and brotherhood when he met a group of Somali boys. And this was around about the same time that he decided he wanted to kind of be with them. And he decided around about this time, or he didn't decide, I'm sorry. One of his teachers actually gave him an assignment about Syria. And it was find the current events going on in Syria. And what Abdullahi realized is that these Somali boys were also very interested in Syria. But their interest in Syria was actually ISIS videos. And one of the things that Abdullahi said is, and I get this exactly, there was a real sense of brotherhood with those boys and belonging. It felt like they were welcoming me into something. And Abdullahi remembers very clearly that when he watched those ISIS videos, those people in those videos were not helpless bystanders, but Abdullahi called them noble warriors. And Abdullahi said, I wanted that too. And he talked about how he would share with his cohort, you know, these visions, these dreams of becoming the Green Berets of ISIS. And Abdullahi was actually apprehended on his way to Syria to join ISIS in the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. Another gentleman that I don't know him as well, but I find his story to be just fascinating. His name is Muhammad Hamadur Rahman. And Muhammad is a second generation Bengali who did live in Portsmouth, the coastal town in the UK. And the interesting thing I think about Muhammad is that he was a manager at a discount clothing store. And, you know, he traveled with a bunch of his, you know, other young men to Syria. And he actually made it to ISIS and he made it to the battlefield. And one of the things, though, that I think is interesting for Muhammad, another young man who traveled with him was this young man who tweeted this a few years before they left. He said, sometimes I just get sick of generic life. I'm living in the West to eat, study, work, pay tax, sleep, slave. And one of the things that I think all of those young men who traveled together, it was very clear that that trip for them meant significance. That trip meant that people would know who they were and that, frankly, they mattered in ways they had never mattered before. Next, I want to share with you a young man who I have only recently come to know, and his name is Bruno. And Bruno is interesting because he is from a town just outside of Atlanta called Milton, Georgia. And Bruno just recently spent his senior year learning online. He lives at home with his parents. He was most well known in his community because he built elaborate tree houses. And some people may have been paying attention to Bruno in the past couple of years, but if they were, they would have noticed he was becoming a bit more extreme online, a bit more radical, perhaps, in his beliefs. And the thing about Bruno is he traveled with his parents to the Stop the Steal rally in Washington on January 6th. And Bruno will tell the story that, as well as parents, that he was separated from his parents and he was curious and ended up, inside the Capitol. And the feds tell a little bit of a different story in that they claim that Bruno brought a baton with him and had actually planned and rallied. And what's interesting, I think, about Bruno is when you look at some of his social media, he speaks the words prior to, well prior to January 6th. For instance, in May of 2020, he posed with his gun and he said, "I will die before I give up my Second Amendment." He then also said, before January 6th, President Trump is calling us to fight. It is we, the people, against the tyrants. So not only was he talking about his own significance and his own going, but he was trying in many of these messages to rally others about standing up for themselves. And for Bruno, it was very clear that he was in a fight of good versus evil, and he had purpose and meaning and significance. And finally, I want to share with you a very different man. This is a man named Naj. And Naj is really interesting to me because I came to know him through my work in prison in Marion Correctional Institute here in Ohio. And Naj was arrested when he was very young for violent crime, and he served 20 years in prison. And the thing that I think is interesting about Naj is it was in prison that he will tell you he found himself. He learned JavaScript. He learned to speak Spanish fluently. he became a leader. He was part of the team that brought TEDx to a prison. And the thing about Naj is that he left prison and he had about 40 job interviews where he couldn't get anyone to see all of these new things that he was. He couldn't get anyone to see kind of what he was bringing. So he eventually became a prison volunteer again. He went back inside. And ultimately, Naj became involved in crime again and was killed in a shootout. But I think what's interesting to me about Naj is where he felt belonging and significance and where he didn't. And that brings me to this. Last week, I had the privilege of being on a call with a woman who was a former Moonie. And she spent 5 years as a Moonie and has spent the last 20 years working as a deprogrammer, as she calls it, taking people out of extremist groups, taking people out of cults, taking people out of terrorist groups. And recently, she said she keeps getting all of these calls from young people who are trying to get their parents to disengage from Q and other things. And what this woman shared is a fairly interesting, simple, yet profound model. She said, people have human needs, Heather. And she said, if those human needs aren't met, people are vulnerable. And some people are more vulnerable than others. And when offered by someone else, you know, two solutions, right? The first being, hey, here's some easy answers to life's hard questions. This is us versus them. This is good versus ill. This is the black and whiteness of the world. That's one thing that really appeals. The other thing is, hey, here's some purpose, some meaning, and some ways to contribute. And her sharing this was just so powerful for me because I think this is something that I believe about kind of extremism pretty much across the board. And what I want to share now, just very, very quickly, is a couple of ideas of how we have tried to take some of these lessons and some of these learnings and reframe them to think about what as community can we do to reach out to folks who are in those vulnerable places. And, you know, one of our just understandings is all human beings have belonging, purpose, meaning, and contribution needs. It is when those needs can actually be met that we're able to flourish. There's this other piece here. People want to make tangible contributions to causes bigger than themselves. For every person that I talked to you about tonight, that was important to them. People want to matter. And this one, people want to be helpers and not always the helped. You know, I shared this in Abdullahi's story. He saw people being noble warriors and not innocent bystanders. That's such a compelling narrative for, I think, so many people, including someone like Bruno. And finally, as community members, as humans, how can we intentionally think about including those who are typically not in the room? How can we choose the folks who are not chosen in certain ways that enable us to reimagine how we connect with one another? So I will stop there, and I will happily take questions.
Good. So thank you, Heather. Thank you, Matt. I'm just going to start down with these questions, and obviously the first couple are for Matt because they came in. And so maybe, well, let's go with the first one. Matt, this is from Hunter Taylor. Are the policies and aims of the Free State Project basically the same as those as the Freetown Project?
Oh, that's a really good question. So yes, the policies and the aims are very, very similar. However, the Freetown Project and the Free State Project are very different things. The Free State Project, most of you probably know, is the idea of turning the entire state of New Hampshire into a libertarian dominated state, you know, to change the policies, to protect individual freedoms and that sort of thing. And so that was basically the same exact idea as the Freetown Project. They both sprang out of the same white paper written by Jason Sorens of the Cato Institute and occasionally Dartmouth. And so they're very similar, but the difference is that the Free State Project is a lot more polished. It's a lot more kind of professional and smooth. They have funding, they have staffing, they're better organized. The Free Town Project was really like the fringe of the fringe. And the Free State Project has been very effective at getting free staters and libertarians and people with libertarian philosophies into the state house. And one place that we really saw that recently was with this whole anti-mask thing that's been building over the last year. That was a place where it was just such a natural issue for libertarians to latch onto. And they found a lot of acceptance within more mainstream Republican circles for that philosophy, to the extent that a week after the New Hampshire state legislature elected its leader, Dick Hinch, he died of COVID. And then that 5 days later, they come out with the vaccine. So that's a little tragic tangent, I suppose. But the short answer is they're different entities. The Free State Project doesn't want to own the Free Town Project's mistakes. There are meaningful distinctions between them, but the overall idea, goals, aims, purposes, and strategy are all the same.
So I have a question. There's a crossover between your two presentations in my mind. And one is that Matt's presentation proved Heather's theory that people most want to be needed and accepted into a group. And I'd actually like to ask both of you how you can keep people from those people that Heather's referring to from joining a group like the Free Staters, because as you said, they, on the surface of it, they seem like us.
Heather, you want to take that first?
Sure. I mean, I think, I often think that this idea that folks have human needs, right? We all have needs to belong. We all have needs for purpose and meaning, right? And contribution. And so some of us get those needs met in like super healthy ways, right? We get them met through our work, we get them out through our family or through our religious institution or through our volunteer work. And I think that for some folks, that's just not true, right? And so I think that's where this can get tricky is, and for me, I think that the part that has always been very interesting is who are the folks that aren't chosen, right? And I think the work that I did in Western Europe, I worked primarily with Muslim communities in Western Europe throughout the 2000s. And oftentimes those young people had a narrative that they were never chosen, right? There were expectations of them that were incredibly low. They were always looked at as liabilities. They were never looked at as assets. And so I think when terrorist groups engaged with them and said, hey, you're an asset, we could use you, you matter, all of a sudden it lit up things for these young people that no one had ever actually told them before. So to me, I think about even my Naj, right? I think about Naj. If Naj would have found belonging well before he was 20, would he have even committed his violent crime? If someone had seen worthiness in Naj, right? So I guess that's where I come from, is how do we see worthiness early? How do we offer ways for people to contribute early? How do we see people as assets, all people as assets early, so that we're not getting to this place where they're finding that for the first time in something that is extreme and perhaps very detrimental?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I was kind of struck as I listened to Heather speak during her presentation by that same thing. Like, we're really almost saying like the same thing from radically different perspectives, right? That we are not going to be able to touch. But we always want to be able to provide people with a narrative that meets their internal needs for self-worth. I did a story for the Weather Channel that was just published a week ago about a woman who, when she was an infant, she became poisoned with the highest levels of lead of any American before or since. She was poisoned by a local mining company that made an active decision to release lead into her community, knowing that it would poison kids. And so she's grown up, she's 47 now. And so you would think she would be the biggest environmental activist, tree-hugging hippie in the world. But she's not. She's not. She's actually much more sympathetic to Republicans. Why? Because in the Republican worldview, the story of her life is that despite the raw hand she was dealt, she was able to overcome and persevere, and nothing held her back and nothing changed her. And she pulled herself up by her bootstraps. Whereas all the left offers her is a portrait of victimhood. The sense of like, oh, you poor thing. And who wants to live that life of being that poor thing? And so I think there's a certain breed of person, a certain type of personality type of kind of like the tough talking guy who tells it like it is, who likes the idea that there is a bit of physical danger maybe sometimes in their life, or something that they can really show off their physicality. And I think that used to be the union guy who was standing strong in strikes and sticking it to the man. And yet somehow like we've lost that narrative entirely. And I think we need to find that kind of narrative infrastructure and reinforce it. And, if we're founding bipartisan hunting clubs or setting up a shack at the NASCAR rallies, I think that is an important thing that we have to strengthen.
So are you ready for your next question? This is from our Martha Rich. In your book, Matt, you talk about libertarians' love of logic, which I encountered and sought to respect, at least in one-on-one discussions. Martha is a wonderful canvasser for us, which is what she's referring to. I'd like to hear more about that in connection with your advice to help the libertarians we know pull back from the white supremacy and the other dark lures they have. I'm thinking how hard it is to argue anyone out of affiliation, boy is she right, with far-right cults, that it's more a matter of identity than logic. Your thoughts? And then she has a PS. I'm thinking Heather is offering some answers, helping people find different kinds of connection and sense of purpose.
Yep, Martha, thank you for the good work you do going door to door. I know how hard that can be. And I think you've really put your finger on it. So logic, it's funny. Yeah, like academic research shows that libertarians are more logical than the rest of us, in aggregate. On average, the libertarian is more logical than your average Democrat or Republican. But I would say that if we progressives get an F in logic, the libertarians maybe get like a D-. Like none of us are really driven that much by logic. And there's a lot of psychological research and neurological research that shows that oftentimes the logical arguments that we present are just ways to kind of justify what we already want or already want to do. However, that being said, so I feel your pain that you can't go and argue a libertarian out of a position. But what I would say is that someone who grows up liking to think of themselves as very logical and engaging in these sorts of debates and public discourse, that's really an invitation to talk, right? And so I would look at every argument with a libertarian not as an opportunity to win an argument, but as an opportunity to build a relationship. And you want to drop information that is not coming at them head on. That there's a researcher at Dartmouth, Mary, I'm blanking on her last name, but she develops board games with social messages. And she found out that if you come out with a board game that's designed to teach someone a social message and you make it very overt, it doesn't work. What you have to do is you have to make 1 out of 10 components or interactions in the game reinforce that social message, that less is more. And I would suggest that when you're having a conversation, don't try to beat the person down by arguing better or louder. I would say they want to be heard and listened to, and drop them a couple nuggets, plant a couple seeds, and try to continue that conversation in another setting.
Okay, our next is from Lindsay Dearborn. Heather, I'm so struck by your stories. Are these people are there people in the CIA, FBI, Homeland Security that are also knowledgeable? We also had another question about this. I am curious about the confidentiality in telling these people's story. Do they give consent if they're alive? Are these stories known through Heather's work in the State Department?
So I will say this. I no longer work for the State Department. I resigned in 2012. And so what I have shared with you, as a trained former Intel analyst, I am always very conscientious about what I share or don't share. And I will tell you that everything that I have shared is in the public realm. So you will see it. It's all in the press. It's all out there. So that is why I think, we can absolutely share. And I think it's also important to say, a couple of those are court cases and they're alleged. And so that's important, right? They haven't been proven yet. So I think that is true. As to folks, I have a lot of respect for my colleagues who are civil servants, who have committed their lives to national security. And so I have worked with some of the smartest people, I think, in the world, who do this work and who do it because they absolutely want to protect our country and keep it safe and make sure that we all can live lives where we flourish. So I have a lot of respect for the folks that I have worked with, those civil servants.
So Amelia Serene has a question that I have as well for Matt. In the first picture with a bear leaning on a structure, first of all, that is the biggest bear I've ever seen, even in the National Geographic. And second of all, what was that structure? Was it, it looked like a fire tower, but it was only like 5 feet.
Oh, it looks big, but it's actually a Lego model. No, I'm kidding. I actually do not know the answer to those questions. I did not take that picture myself, and so I have not seen that structure in person. So perhaps this will be a natural history mystery for all of us.
All right. Well, Rich Abel, who is one of our very wonderful, hardworking state reps, has a question. I serve in the New Hampshire House. This year, I see a movement among the Libertarian Free State group in the legislature from being anarchist to being fascist authoritarians. Sorry, Rich. Do you agree? And how do we explain this? So he's saying they've gone from being anarchical to fascistic.
Heather, do you have thoughts?
What's making them move farther to the right? I think that's for both of you.
All right, I'll answer first, and then we'll see if Heather has thoughts to add as well. I definitely do see this increase in extremism, and I think what it is it's kind of the more power you have, the more emboldened you are to pursue further reaching goals. I think we see this in pretty much any setting. And so what we've got in the State House is a Libertarian Party that 4 years ago was really making an effort to find some things within its philosophy and within its policy goals that had a lot of universal appeal, like decriminalization of marijuana. But as they've become more established, as they've formed the first caucus in the State House that they've had in a long time, as they've gathered more members and been fairly successful at grassroots organizing, they want to be more pure and loud and proud about the extremist edges of their philosophy. And so a couple of years ago, the Libertarian Party, the state party, their official apparatus, formally voted to adopt secessionism as a goal So now, before they were kind of afraid, that seemed a little extreme. But now, something like 40% of Americans by some polls favor seceding in some cases, depending on how you word the question. And as a result, now they are emboldened to kind of reach a little bit higher. Hey, why not shoot for the moon a little bit? And I think that the pandemic and the what they see as a massive overstep by the government at curtailing personal freedoms with the public health warnings and the mask issue and all of this, I think that really has provided a ground where they could not only pair up with Republicans more effectively, but where they could also go out to somebody who was sick and tired of being told to wear a mask in a grocery store and provide a kind of compelling argument. And I think that kind of fed the beast a little bit. Heather, what do you think? Is this how these movements work?
I mean, this makes me think about, honestly, this idea of like easy answers to life's hard questions. Because it feels to me like anarchy is like this anarchist space is a lot more frenetic than a fascist authoritarian kind of space, right? It just feels a lot simpler, a lot cleaner in some ways. And it just makes me think about like our national narrative and where we have gotten to, where we got to pre-election, for the whole four years, right? And just, I feel like this idea of, there's right, there's wrong, there's good, there's evil, pick a side. To me, that is a national narrative that perhaps is a piece of that. It's good marketing, perhaps.
So, Heather, this is a natural question for you. It's from Scott Drysdale. He's looking for practical suggestions for getting out of his bubble. How to organize others to get out of their bubbles.
I feel like my entire job is trying to get folks out of their bubbles. I think Matt said something earlier about finding the similarities, right? And I think a lot of this is around how can you meet other people who care about things. So I'll give you a quick anecdote. I'm doing a project this week about belonging in museums in Columbus, Ohio. But the interesting part of that is we were doing interviews this afternoon with people who are currently experiencing poverty. Most people who we spoke to were Black or people of color, but we spoke to one woman, and she, we're talking about museums, right? We're talking about art museums and science museums. And this woman started crying and telling us about how all of these kids, we have a big crime spree happening in Columbus, and all these kids are getting shot, and what it means to have guns and all of these things. And, it was one of those things like, this is not a person that I would normally talk to. This is not someone whose neighborhood I would normally go to. This is not somebody I really have the occasion to know, but I felt such privilege in listening to her talk and share her perspective and share her expertise, and to just literally take in her wisdom of what she knows of her lived experience. And so I find myself purposefully putting myself in those situations constantly. That's kind of just the way I am, and trying to inspire others, because I feel like, we often look to experts to tell us things when really there's a lot of lived experts who know what it's like. And so how do you put yourself in those streams, and how do you have what can perhaps be an uncomfortable situation, because you assume a thing, they assume a thing, but how can you collectively get to, and I feel like she was willing to have that conversation because she knew we were committed to solving something, right? And so to me, we have a common purpose. Because of that common purpose, I now have the privilege of learning from her. And so to me, that's the magic in it.
So here's a good question for both of you. This is from Kimberly Frost. When I was in college, I took a political science class that explained World War II through three lenses: the balance of power in Europe at the time, the state, Germany, and the individual, Hitler. It sounds as though the speakers today are describing characteristics of the individuals involved in violent extremism, January 6th.
And other. What other lenses should we use to understand this insurrection?
Well, I suppose one thing that I would say is, it's kind of like recycling. Sometimes we talk about it as if the burden is all on the individual, when in fact, when you tilt the playing field or the landscape just a little bit, suddenly you find that everything happens much more easily. And when you pay people a nickel or a dime to return their bottle, all of a sudden a lot more gets recycled. Or when you compel a company to think about its packaging. And so I think probably the same is true about political extremism. And I think we're seeing big tech get involved in ways that I think are uncomfortable for everybody about trying to regulate speech. I think perhaps when we look at what happened in the Capitol on January 6th, in one sense, it was a bunch of individuals who went there to make trouble and who kind of like whipped everything up into a frenzy. But when I look at the video of that event, I also see a lot of people who just kind of like showed up, who were not planning on being violent, but whose body and mass was a critical pawn for those extremists, and that helped them to that was kind of harnessed by the agitators and kind of like drawn in to this horrific violence that we all saw unfold. And so I would think about how policy-wise can we look at these sorts of events and track them back to find those little tipping points and those little places where it's not a mandate, but maybe the first time that the young man that Heather talked about posts something on social media, perhaps some other alternative path forward for him that maintains his sense of self is presented. And maybe you don't get everyone. Was his name Carlo? But Bruno? Maybe you cut into the numbers and you can create a landscape that just does not benefit those people. And it's also people who felt disaffected. So let's figure out how we can make them feel empowered within the system that we have. Heather?
Yeah, Matt, I absolutely agree with you. And oftentimes in the work that I do now, we think about what's the individual level, what's the systems level, what are the beliefs, what are the policies, what are the laws, where are all the different places we can play, right? And I think about, what are the other lenses? I think there's an economic lens for sure, right? I think there's a lens of I live in a Rust Belt town, right, in the middle of Ohio. There's a lot of stuff that is true about a Rust Belt town in Ohio. And there's a lot of stuff that's true about my neighbors who went to the Capitol and why they went, right? Some of whom were not involved in any way. They just went to the rally, right? But there are reasons that aren't necessarily just individual reasons, but there are ways that they have been impacted by what is happening in the world, that when somebody says, we love you, you matter, in many cases, they don't feel that based on systems and policies and laws that they've experienced.
Yeah, and Heather, if I could just add one more point to that, because I think that's so important. And also this goes back to what the other questioner had about, kind of like, what are some practical ways that we can do these sorts of actions? And that made me think about Ben Franklin, my favorite founding father. Ben Franklin, one of my favorite stories about him is he had a legislator who he had some sort of like friction with. And I don't think he even names the guy, but like, there was some bad blood. And so when he wanted to curry favor with that legislator, he laid tracks by first going up to him and saying, hey, I heard that you have this book and I have a big interest in this book. May I please borrow it? And so his advice was essentially to ask a favor of the person that you want to help, and so, if you can ask a favor and get somebody down to your local stream reclamation project with his equipment or muscles and get them to do something positive for a specific environmental place, then perhaps that ethics sort of takes root and gives some downstream effects, no pun intended.
So we have two questions along that same line, which I'm going to ask. And one is, yes?
Well, for just one moment, I'm sorry, hate to interrupt, but I just want to do a check-in because it is 7 and we do have several more questions. I'm not sure, I want to respect the time of Matt and Heather here. I'm not sure what your time is like, if we have a few more minutes or...
That's very kind of you to ask. I'm okay. I know poor Heather has been Zooming all day.
She's Zoom fried.
She may have some Zoom fatigue, but I'm good for another, several questions if folks are interested.
Yeah, and the same. That's fine.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So one overarching question we've got that we can't ignore, and it's just hanging there. Sue and David Taylor asked, why does someone like Trump have such appeal to these folks? That's one question. The other question is, people really consistently are asking about how they can identify. Here's one from Norm Turcott. How can you identify any institutions in our communities, state, or country that attempt to get it right and provide children, individuals with opportunities for meaningful purpose and positive recognition, which is basically what you've been talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab, or Matt, if you want to go first. What?
Sure. Yeah, I would just like to speak to the Trump element of the question. And I think, oddly enough, what I found in talking to libertarians is that they are not fans of Trump. If Trump is, if there's not a viable libertarian candidate, Trump might be their second choice, but they really don't like Trump at all. They see his authoritarian tendencies and his overreach, and that is very antithetical to their notions. One thing that he does do that appeals to them, other than cut government, is they perceive that Trump was going to stop getting America involved in international conflicts. They saw him as a non-interventionist on the global stage, which is kind of like a byproduct of his nationalism, I guess you would say. And I do think that it's a little odd that in my lifetime, we've gone from thinking of Republicans as the party of war hawks to Donald Trump being the person who's saying that we have to send, have fewer troops on the ground, even when there are compelling reasons to be involved. Like that's an area of attack that I think needs to be blunted.
And one thing maybe just to add to that is I come back to my conversation with the former Mooney, and what she said about this idea, easy answers, right, to life's hard questions. And it's not for everyone. I mean, some people I think are fiscally conservative and they held their nose and did what they needed to do. But I do think for a lot of people, this idea of why is this happening to me? Like, why is this my plight in life now? I think Trump provided them with really helpful answers and helped to take away any kind of personal blame. I mean, he helped to say who is bad, who is good, who is he for, what will we become again, right? And so I just think that there's such, in that simplicity, there's just such appeal, and I think for a lot of folks who felt like they were very much left behind, right, whether they were or were not, I think that I just think that resonated quite well. And for the second question, I'm trying to look here, Barbara. Any institutions that are getting it right. So this is interesting. I have a theory, which is perhaps a little bit controversial, but I'm constantly fascinated by the way the U.S. military does recruitment. And I say this because I say it from a super personal place. I have cousins who were recruited by the U.S. military. And, I think oftentimes when they do straight up recruitment, they tell people, we need you, you matter, here's a purpose, here's some meaning, you will have insane belonging, right? Your life has significance by doing these things. And so it's interesting because, you know, I think some people would say, oh, Heather, but it's enough for me to think, they're getting this right. And I think sometimes, especially when they're doing recruitment, right, enlistment or whatever that is, I think they are going to people who aren't typically chosen, you know, and saying this is a pathway. I think, you know, and I think that there are other organizations that are good for young people. I think in urban centers, this tends to be true. But sometimes I think that, you know, the one thing I know about working in counterterrorism for a really long time is we all got paid to do it, right? And so we got paid, you know, you have work hours and then you stop and you have vacation, you got some sick leave. And it was always interesting to me that, like, when you're a real life terrorist, you don't have vacation time, right? Like you, this is what you do and you do it and you're like hardcore and you're always on and you're always doing the thing, right? And so sometimes I feel like people, you know, like if I'm part of a nonprofit and I'm trying to like work with a kid, am I always on or not, right? And I don't know, I offer that up. But I do think that some people try and get this right. But I think it's this idea of how can more of us get it right? How can more of us look to, you know, people that we might count out and say, oh, we actually need you. Like we really, really, truly need you and we need your help.
Let's see. Well, should we call this our final question? Because it's sort of related to everything we've been talking about. It's from Julie Turner. So following up on Scott's question, which was about how we can pop out of our bubble. Do we need to look for projects in common with potential insurrectionists? Is that how we get out of the bubble? Out of our bubble? And then she had a PS, I should have described them as people who might be alienated. So that's definitely for both of you.
Heather, you want to go first?
Sure, I can. Julie, I like the addendum. That feels a little better to me. But you know, I think, I don't know, Matt, I'm going to piggyback on what you said. Like, do we all care about recycling? Like, recycling seems like a pretty innocuous thing that maybe people could get behind, right? Like, what are those things? I think there's more. I think we have more in common than we do that's different, right? And I think that it's really, the art is in figuring out what are the issues that we might be able to work on together, right? And they might not be the hard issues. More than likely, they're not the hard issues, right? But what is we want to reimagine our speed limit on our road, right? Like we want to do a community garden, right? Like what are the things that feel like low-hanging fruit, but that get us moving? I think that's a good first step.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And yeah, I think instead of potential insurrectionists, perhaps we think of them as potential progressives. We should go at them with that kind of, you know, non-antagonistic expectation. And I think partnering on projects specifically is one way to do it. I think another way is to bond outside of the realm of politics at all. I think it's looking for those projects. You know, I was thinking this too, like one compelling narrative, I think that the left used to have that, perhaps it doesn't have that much anymore, is like that idea of like the eco warrior, you know, like the Greenpeace Sea Shepherd guys that used to go out and like just, you know, kick ass out on the high seas. And that was exciting and compelling, you know, and I think there are places in our towns and in our state where we can capitalize on that sort of a narrative. And we can ask folks to show up. And when they show up, we can be very excited about their presence. And we can not try to hit them over the head with a ham-fisted political message. And we can shake their hands and we can send them home. And then we can say, hey, you know, at the very least, when the Civil War starts and everybody rises up, they won't come to my house to shoot me first. You know, we'll have a ticket to their bunker.
Matt, you saying that made me think of Derek Black, and if folks are interested, his book, or it's about him, Rising Out of Hatred, right? And I am so enamored with his story about how David Duke was his godfather, right? And so he comes from a long line of white supremacists, right? And he talks about how he went to college and he tried to hide who he was, right? Even though he still believed, he tried to hide who he was. And eventually he was outed. And there was one kid, and he was a Jewish kid, and he decided that he was going to invite this kid, Derek Black, to dinner every Friday night to whatever, right? For years. And he just did. And Derek talks about how that was a turning point for him, right? Because he said, I got to know somebody, right? To your point of like, how do you just get to know somebody? And he's like, I knew who he was. I knew what his hate was about, but like, it was that breaking down over time. It was that conversation. It was getting to know someone outside of a label, beyond a box, beyond the political talking points, just as human beings, when you get to see, what do we have in common, right? What are our fears? What are our hopes? What are our dreams? What are the things that really make us come alive? And how can we share that with one another? So,
Heather, what a perfect note to end on. And the good news is, I think the sign of a really terrific panel is no one left. The whole hour. But thank you both so much. I think we're all enlightened.
We've solved it. We did it.
It's all taken care of.
Good for a Monday. Good for a Monday.
Good. So
thank you, Barbara and Donna, so much for organizing this, and Anne, of course, and Tim. That this is a great opportunity for us to talk about issues that I think we both care about pretty deeply, and you've made it very easy and fun for us. And I, for one, was very excited about the level of discourse and questions that I heard. So thank you all.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.